I'm going to be talking today about what it amounts to a large degree of judicial activism, I feel, as well as some general things that I see as a form of tyranny from other branches of the state. And I'm going to start off right away with this one. And this, I thought, was just beyond parody. It's a form of satire in a different age and a better time, that a failed asylum seeker can stay in the UK because she joined a terror group, rather than, she has her asylum claim rejected because of this.
Does that make any sense?
So I'll tell you all about it. So she's a Nigerian migrant who had her case thrown out 8 times before succeeding with the claim that even the judge himself admitted was not honest, which one has to wonder why he allowed it in the first place. Then she had become involved with the indigenous people of Biafra, pretty much seemingly only in order to create a claim for asylum. And she came to the UK in 2011 and has been here applying for asylum ever since. And she joined this group in 2017, and the group itself is a separatist group that has been blamed for acts of violence against the Nigerian state, which shouldn't necessarily be Britain's problem, but they're classed as a terrorist organisation in Nigeria, but they're not prescribed in the UK. And it's a bit of a loophole whereby she can now be protected, because if we deport her back to her home country, then she will face persecution according to human rights lawyers. However, she's willingly done this to get this asylum claim in the first place.
Cynical, isn't it?
Well, it's not just cynical, is it? It's fraud.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not, she's doing this for that purpose. It's a form of fraud here in the UK, even, and one could, I suspect, criminally, perhaps even argue that case, trying to gain some sort of, particularly if she was able to access, as a result, benefits or any sort of material benefit, then you've got pecuniary advantage through fraud. Well, so perhaps there's even a case there. But I think that the point here is that there are also people behind this who have clearly advised her, who clearly directed her as to how to avoid the deportation. So we've got people who are actively working against the spirit of the law. There are loopholes in just about every piece of legislation. No piece of legislation, no matter what it's about, can foresee every single set of circumstances. And that's one of the things about common law, really. I mean, you look at the circumstances, you adjust accordingly. I'll come back to that. But in this particular case, we have got people who do not want to, lawyers and others, activists, who are not looking at what the purpose of the law is, but the actual letter of the law, in a rather, as though it's codified law. Now, we've been exposed, without talking about Brexit, to sort of 40 years thereabouts of European Union codified law. So, which is very much, the letter of the law. They don't have the same judicial system as us. They don't have the common law system. And as a result, I think a lot of our lawyers, a lot of our judges, 40 years, that's a career. Pretty much, So people have entered the legal profession being exposed to European legislation, which is a very different beast. So it's not about the spirit of the law and what it's there to do. It's about the letter of the law, whereas our tradition is somewhat different. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but that's how I see things as a former police officer and having dealt with the European Union, worked for the European Union for 3 years. And so I think, there is all of that we've got to unpack as a nation. Do we want law that has a purpose and we respect the aims of that law? Or do we want to simply apply the literal letter of the law? Now, that's what a judge is for. A judge makes a judgment as to whether or not this is right or wrong, ultimately, in our tradition. You go to, Austria. You can be an Austrian judge. You go through your training and then you become a judge. You don't have to have the experience, because all you've got to be able to do is look it up. Now, that's what we're doing here now, I think. And it's being exploited because, as I say, no law can predict every single set of circumstances. Like, this is a unique set of circumstances. And we see it over and over again, that same application. Plus, of course, we've got the problem here in the UK of the Human Rights Act, which really, linked to the European Convention on Human Rights. And so we've got all of that to unpack as well. And when people say to me, well, why can't we just do what the Americans do and then, just make a decree that we're going to do X, Y, and Z? Well, the United States never tied itself to these sort of things. It never tied itself to a sort of extra sort of national or a higher multilateral form of legislation like the European Convention on Human Rights. So we've got to untangle ourselves from that if we're going to solve these sort of problems, and they are prolific. As I think you're going to maybe touch on some others, but
I certainly will. Yeah.
So anyway, that's not really in a nutshell, but I think there's a lot to this. There's no simple answer. It's not simply activist judges. That's part of the problem, yes, because there's this sort of intellectual, sort of urban elite kind of attitude regarding multiculturalism, regarding how society should look in the modern era, and the globalist sort of agenda. But all of that is there as well. So we've got a lot of work to do if we want to safeguard the British public.
I think there is this giant edifice, just this individual Nigerian woman. It's obviously not in our interest to have her in this country, but she's just the tiny pinnacle of the problem, as you say. Do you think it's too radical or too authoritarian to say, let's look at this giant monster of the NGOs, the activists, the lawyers, the nature of the judiciary itself, questions of actual jurisprudence, what should law be, and what do we need to do to actually prevent us being exploited in this cynical way? Well, it should all sit with Parliament, right?
It should.
Get rid of the Supreme Court, get rid of the ECHR, anything that stands in the way from preventing this sort of thing from happening to us over and over again. It all should be looked at, and if needs be, got rid of.
I agree, and this is a matter for our politicians, and without the Conservative Party in no way, no how, let's get this clear, deserved anybody's votes at the last general election. I mean, they made negligence, incompetence, have run this country right into the ground. However, as I was warning before the general election, be careful, because if Labour get in, particularly if they get a stonking majority, we are going to have an even greater problem. And people were telling me, no, Labour can't be as bad as the Conservatives, no way, no how. Well, we've got Labour, and they are a damn sight worse. And that's part of the problem. We're not going to be able to tackle any of these problems as long as we've got a Labour government. The Conservatives dug us deeper into the hole, I agree, but through negligence and incompetence, as I say, not through deliberate ideological policy, I think. But that's maybe a slightly different discussion. I agree with you that we've got to address all of those things. I agree with you, effectively, what you're saying, that Parliament is the authority. The people are sovereign, but Parliament is the representatives of the people, and therefore it is up to them to do democratic bidding. The country is downright angry at this sort of thing. It is not the democratic will of the British people, as exercised in elections or in on the streets or in any other way, that this should happen. What they want is this. They want this sort of thing, like this Nigerian woman. They want that stopped and ended. First problem: Parliament, our elected representatives, need to listen to the people. I think we might touch on that later. The second thing, though, is, as I say, it can't happen overnight. Some politicians would have you believe that just having the determination, the will, the courage to say, no, get rid of these people and get rid of the Supreme Court and cancel the Human Rights Act, it can just be driven by personality. Wrong. Because we have tied ourselves into these sort of various mechanisms and systems. We have to untangle all of that. And pieces of legislation very rarely stand alone, like the Human Rights Act relates to the ECHR. So you've got to untangle yourself from all of this. We're tied in this net. And
it's doable, though, right?
It's doable.
It's not a Gordian knot. It's not beyond the wit of man.
No, but it's a very complicated knot.
Right, okay.
And we do have to untangle it. I mean, you get a bit of fishing line, you can untangle it, but by God, by the end of it, you're going to be exhausted. But so it's a bit like that. It can be done. But it can only be done if you've got the vision the courage, the will, the determination, and the political support to do it. And what we've done in the last general election is not just hand Labour power, but a massive majority. And they are unassailable. There are people who say, well, give it a year, 18 months, they'll be out or whatever. They won't, because they are not going to vote themselves out. There's no way of getting rid of them at the moment. And we're in a hole. So this situation is going to get worse and become more embedded. That's my fear. And no political party really, I won't play party politics, but I don't think really any political party is yet effective in proposing how we untangle this. There is, I will, we must, they've got it wrong, this is a problem. But there's no solution out there. There's no credible solution being put over in a way that the people on the street can either access or understand. And that's a problem as well, because then people follow. We were talking before we came on air about psychology of people sort of following the group type of thing. That's because they're not well informed, because no politician is putting out there the real facts, nor is the mainstream media, really. So anyway, so you asked a fairly straightforward question and I went off on one, sorry.
It's all very interesting.
That's just my opinion.
It's great, that's why you're here. Great stuff.
So I've got lots of other examples that are probably rather infuriating, but I'm going to go over them nonetheless. Criminal avoids deportation to Portugal. Remember, Portugal is supposedly a safe country, European country. People in Britain go on holiday there, so it can't be that bad. Because he has a child with special needs. I imagine Portugal has the ability, this child with special needs, I believe, has autism. And I don't think Portugal is so bad as you can argue that it is completely uninhabitable for people with autism. I think that's a very tough case to argue.
Of course it is. I mean, but again, we go back to the letter of the law. Mm-hmm. Judges aren't really, and some of these tribunals are not looking at what is reasonable or what is in the interests of society. They are looking at the letter of the law. And if you find some little, some sort of gap in it, then you can exploit it. That's the reality of where we are. And then you get parliamentary time taken up, if they want to, in trying to close that little hole, rather than the judicial system doing its job and the tribunal system doing its job to make sure that the purpose of the law, the spirit of the law is imposed on the case. Now, I mean, when you look at this, I mean, I know people who have emigrated to Portugal from the UK because they think the conditions over in Portugal are a great deal better in all sorts of respects than here. I don't know, I've never been to Portugal, so it's not a recommendation, but so it's not about safety and so on. It is about it's about what's in the interest of the British people, and the laws of this land are the laws of this land, and they are for the people who live in this country, not the people who would do it harm, not the people who don't have a right to be here. We've got to put the British people first, and I have still yet again to hear. I mean, yes, Nigel Farage and William Clouston, they put, the British people first. But I have yet to sort of feel that there is a movement in this country, a political movement back into the House of Commons, back into Parliament, where our role is to enhance the confidence, the optimism, prosperity and security of every man, woman and child living in the United Kingdom. British citizens first amongst those. I don't see that. And I don't think that's rocket science. But it seems to evade politicians of all sorts.
Mm-hmm. I very much agree, and I'm going to bring up another example, and they're going to get even more frustrating. Zimbabwean paedophile allowed to stay in UK because he would face hostility back home, and I don't think we've exactly got a positive reception here either. So I don't know how one can make that argument, but I imagine it's the same sort of thing that you were alluding to before. And we're seeing even more sort of twisted, dark irony here. Here's another one, again from the Telegraph. They've been very good recently. Pakistani paedophile escaped deportation because it would harm his children. Which, where do you even start with it?
It's just ludicrous, isn't it? And look, to my basic way of thinking, and I think probably good 90% of the British population, if a foreign national comes to this country and commits a crime, such as paedophilia, then they damn well need to go home, and I don't care what the consequences for them are. They face the consequences. He knows the law. One of the problems we've got in this country is a lot of people come to this country, they don't want to integrate, they want to bring with them their own culture, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think sometimes it creates tensions, and again, we might talk about that, I don't know. But if somebody comes to this country not integrating, wanting to live the way they do back in their home society, back here in the UK, and they commit a criminal offence, then they're doing so with that grounding in their own legal system, their own social norms, their own cultural norms back in the country that they've come from, Pakistan or wherever. So if you don't come here and commit a sex crime, particularly paedophilia, and then expect to get away with it, damn well F off back to the place you came from. And if you don't like the consequences, well, you shouldn't have bloody well done it, should you? And that's how I see it. We've got to look after the interests of the British people, not foreign nationals. It's for those countries to look after and deal with the justice issues and the criminal issues of those people, not us.
What a state we're in that even really needs to be stated, or that opinion or your voice has to be on some sort of alternative media platform. What a terrible thing! It should be just de rigueur. That I don't care that your country of origin has got human rights abuses. That's on you. Again, don't do the crime then.
Do you know what this almost implies? Almost, and I probably some lawyer who's not got the interest of the United Kingdom at heart, but actually can make some money out of this, might one day argue, and I hope no such person is listening to us now. I don't want to give them ideas, but this almost says, if you've committed paedophilia in Pakistan, then you can claim asylum in the United Kingdom. Yeah. Now that's almost what this says. If you're in the United Kingdom and you do something like that, then you can stay here because to avoid the consequences back in your own country. If you're already in that country, the next step is to say, come here to avoid prosecution there. It's a slippery slope, and I cannot grasp how any politician in Parliament or anywhere else can fail to stand up and say this. Yeah, because by not saying it, they're saying, well, it is, because it's back to that confidence, optimism, prosperity, and security. You're neglecting confidence, optimism, prosperity. Well, not the prosperity so much, but the securities most certainly. And security isn't just about guns and bullets. It's also about this sort of thing.
Of course, it's not just Pakistan and Nigeria. It's any country that's sort of internationally recognised as being guilty of sort of human rights abuses, where you might face torture or an unfair trial or something in the country of origin. So that's vast swathes of the world.
Of course it is. I mean, we are very, very lucky in this country. Sometimes we forget it. I'm constantly moaning and grumbling about the state of the country. We all are probably. But actually, we forget that most of the world is in a pretty poor state. And if we're going to say that anybody who can receive better healthcare in the UK, or is less likely to be, or more likely in the UK to get a fair hearing on something, or whatever it might be, then we are opening the doors, in principle, to the majority of the world's population. Now, then we come on to the practical impact, as well as the cultural impact, and the tensions, the social tensions that brings. But it's just ridiculous. You can't do that and survive. What happens is you don't level up the rest of the world, you level down the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom can never be, again, if you do that, what it was held up to be for centuries, really, as being the sort of bastion of fairness, of democracy, of human rights, of justice. We're losing that, not because we don't still try to build it, but because we're letting in so many people that compromise those positions.
There's also another dimension to this, in that people outside of Britain are now aware that we're a soft touch on these sorts of things. And I'm reminded of what one of my former colleagues, Callum, said. He went out to Afghanistan and spoke to the Taliban there, which hats off to him. And they were saying that, well, loads of our worst people, the worst people in Afghanistan have fled to Europe because they've realised that they can basically get away with their crimes more easily in European countries than they can in Afghanistan. Yeah. And I think that we're seeing that to a large extent. Lots of other countries, particularly those in North Africa and the Middle East, are pretty candid about the fact that the people who are coming here are their worst. They're all too happy to get rid of them as well. And of course, they're going to go to a place where they can do whatever they want. And this fact is not only frustrating from the point of view that it's an injustice in and of itself, but also that it promotes further injustice by advertising the fact that this is going on to other people. And there was a trend that I managed to identify actually, in who was actually looking, what international outlets were reporting on the number of illegal boat crossings into Britain. And it was all of the countries in which the majority of the so-called asylum seekers were coming from in the first place. And so what these media organisations were actually doing is creating an advert for these people. So I was confused why the Afghani press was concerned about our border security, or some North African countries, and it's because there's interest in it because they want to do the same. It's not that they look upon us with sympathy, it's that they're looking at us to exploit our good nature.
Indeed. I for some time was advisor to the Albanian Prime Minister years ago, and I also headed up the UK's efforts to counter transnational organised crime coming from that area of the Balkans, what's now the Republic of Northern Macedonia, southern Serbia, parts of Greece, Kosovo, and Albania. And I was also in Kosovo before the NATO bombing.
You know a thing or two about Afghanistan as well, don't you?
I did. 27 months in Helmand, yeah. But he's not the only one who's spoken to the Taliban. But different topics, perhaps. But in Albania, when Tony Blair opened Britain to Kosovar refugees, Sweden did likewise, particularly Sweden. There were a handful of us, because there were only a handful of us in the region at the time, who were saying, for God's sake, don't do this, because part of the war in Kosovo, unknown, because it's never hit the mainstream media, everybody had the idea. I mean, I'm not backing any side in this at all, but the Serbs were the evil, nasty ones, and the Albanians were the victims, because that was against the backdrop of the Balkan Wars, where the Serbs had been, But we were saying, actually, both are a problem. Part of the problem in Kosovo, and part of the trigger for the war in Kosovo, was Albanian organised crime, and the Serbs not having the sophistication, if you like, law enforcement or security sophistication, to address it, with minimum force and in the appropriate manner. So there were two sides to that. But we were saying to London and to Washington, do not do this. Do not bring these people in, because if you do, you are just going to have a flood of organised crime. Because organised crime in that part of the world was absolutely prolific.
I think we're
particularly Albanian.
Seeing the consequences of this, because I was actually able to calculate with the government statistics that Albanians, relative to their population, are 32 times overrepresented in our prisons.
Indeed.
And that's actually the highest of any nationality.
I think 1 in 4 Albanians in this country, if I understand this correctly, has at some point been imprisoned in this country. Now, with the Albanians came human trafficking, the sex trade, came a lot of opiate trafficking, a lot of firearms trafficking. And when we talk about borders, we talk about the immigrants and the boats coming across the channel, but all of the cocaine, all of the heroin, about 97% of the firearms used in crime in this country come across our borders illegally. Okay, a lot of that is down to Albanians. Now, we opened all of that. Now, surely, when you've got 1 in 4 of an immigrant group living in the UK having served a prison sentence in the UK, give or take a little bit, surely, if your interests are protecting the UK and enforcing the rule of law, it's time to say no more Albanians come into the United Kingdom until this is sorted out. Albania? Point the finger at Albania. But we don't. And I don't understand it. I get so upset because I see this threat. Everybody sees this threat, and it is a threat. If you've got 4 people in front of you and you know that one is an international heroin smuggler, then you've got a concern. You've got to, you can't just ignore that. But we are. It's back to Parliament again and the government. So I think, yes, they themselves, the Albanians, have been incredibly engaged on social media in terms of moving across here. But it's not just social media. It's about the networks of transnational organised crime. And our police are way behind the loop. The police look at what they call cross-county lines. It's not cross-county lines at all. That's an American phraseology. It's actually, that terminology in itself kind of creates layers of criminality in the UK, which is inappropriate in the UK. It's just a buzzword that makes you sound good if you're a senior police officer. The fact is we've got transnational organised crime bringing all of these illegal commodities into the United Kingdom, and we're doing very, very little about it. Very little. Because we fail, one of the... I know I'm talking a lot, forgive me, but in Russian, bolton means chatterbox. But if you refuse, for whatever reason, to acknowledge that a particular part of the British community has a propensity towards certain criminality, then you are failing to acknowledge that the problem. No, put it in a medical analogy. If you don't diagnose the disease correctly, either you'll think that there's no disease and you don't have to treat it, or there's a good chance you'll apply the wrong treatment and possibly even kill the patient. We're not diagnosing this because we can't talk about it. When I was a police officer in Reading at that time, the Pakistani community had a particular propensity, young Pakistani lads, towards theft of and from motor vehicles. Fine. More so than any other part of the community in Reading. We couldn't talk about that. But then, so what? You have to apply the same policing methodology to everybody? Because you can't say, well, it's just those people in that part of the town.
Well, it's wasting resources.
It is. So you see my point here. And we don't talk about the fact that a lot of these predatory sex crimes are committed by people from particular societies. No, I'm not going to say Muslim, because there are a lot of places, Muslims in the country, that absolutely are, find this abhorrent. But there are other societies, other communities in the world from which we've received immigrants, asylum seekers or others, where it's not, where it's acceptable behaviour. Go back to Afghanistan. The British military were very well aware and had a bit of an issue with how to manage the fact that adult men would, and particularly sort of district governors and so on, would employ T-boys. Now these T-boys, I mean, they would once a year, the district governor would gather, families would come into the compound, bring their 11, 12-year-old boys in to be sort of interviewed and looked at by the district governor, and then employed by the district governor as a T-boy. Well, the T-boy would be sleeping with the district governor. Okay, that's the reality. And if you want details, I mean, that's not something I suppose or I've heard. It's something I know. And then those families would gain privileges as a result of this lad being with the governor for a year or so. That family would get sort of the patronage of the district governor. So this is normal. There's nothing involuntary about this. This is normal social behaviour. So when you bring people in from those sort of societies without acknowledging that, and you don't require integration, which we don't, you don't make any effort. I mean, there's 17 different categories of people who come into this country who don't have to meet the English language tests even. So when you do that, then you've got to expect. You're stupid if you don't expect that sort of behaviour to be transferred and transplanted into the United Kingdom by those people. It will be. It's normal for them. They're used to it. Now, let's not even judge it. But it brings their behaviour into conflict with our values. there we have a problem.
Mm-hmm. I'll judge it. It's disgusting, completely obscene.
I know. I thought you might. I do as well. But you don't. My point is, you don't even have to judge it to know that these two cultural norms, if you like, and values and principles are so vastly far apart that there's no bridge across them. Mm-hmm. And that's my point. Even if you don't even judge it, that's a huge gulf that is going to create problems in society. And if you haven't got a united society, you haven't got a society. You've got friction. And then if you go down to the judgmental route, absolutely right, then how much does that multiply that effect?
So,
you have to whip through a few links.
Yeah, no. I think we've made the point, but yes, there are some other ones. A drug dealer was allowed to stay in Britain after promising to only smoke cannabis, which is still against the law.
It is like a parody.
It is.
It's like a sketch.
And then Starmer has actually backed the deportation of one person, apparently an Albanian, relating to a previous conversation, has tried to resist his deportation because his son only likes chicken nuggets in Britain. He doesn't like foreign chicken nuggets.
Now, to be fair, when I was in Albania, there was no McDonald's in.
Oh well,
there probably is now. So I mean, look.
But you get the point, right? There's another one here. Caribbean woman staying in the UK illegally claims she can't be deported to Grenada as her Latvian husband won't be able to cope with the spicy food. Boo-hoo. I don't care. We can deport them both. Why not?
Yeah, don't break up families.
This is an important point. I think when somebody comes into the United Kingdom, if we give them the right to remain here, leave to remain here, under whatever, whether they're a student or whether they're whoever they are, anyone who is allowed in as because of their association with that person, spouses, children, whatever, they are there on the basis that the sort of, if you like, the principal immigrant is here. If that principal immigrant, and I think they should be required to sign a document to this effect, if that principal immigrant commits an offence, let's say something that carries a 6-month or longer sentence, not necessarily that is awarded 6 months, because in this country, you can commit all sorts of crimes and you should be sentenced to incarceration, but you're not. But anyway, so potentially carries a 6-month or more prison sentence, then not only do they become deportable, is that word? Deportable? But so does anyone who is here on their ticket. It is not you can stay because they're here. So if you've come in with your wife and 2 kids, and now you do something and we can't deport you, well, we at the moment we can't deport you because one of your children likes chicken nuggets or something stupid like this, or doesn't like, you don't like spicy food. Well, forget that. They go with you because you've got no right to be here, so nor have they by association. They go too. And if your wife and kids don't like that, best they have a word with you then. Rather than it's you got them into this mess.
That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And yes, it's to the point now where reading the news is like reading the satire of 20 years ago, and it's in a very unfortunate place.